All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Emily and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our Race for Climate Action student learning session today. This session is intended for Enactus students who are interested in the Race for Climate Action, but by all means, if you are unfamiliar with the Race for Climate Action, we're also glad that you're here with us. We intended this session to help inspire our students who are working on climate-related projects and those projects that they might wish to enter in the Race for Climate Action. It's also a great session for students out there who maybe don't have a climate action project yet, but are interested in starting one. So to get things going today, I am pleased to introduce Tamor Ashkin today. He is with Intuit, who is our sponsor of the Race for Climate Action. So Tamor, I'll toss it over to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for everyone who's on the call today. I know some people have different time zones and really appreciate taking time to join this session. And let me know if my connection is off, Emily. I know I'm calling from Mexico and the joys of remote working, but yeah, I'm Tamor. I'm the strategic partner manager at Intuit. So for those of you who don't know, Intuit is a technology company based in the US, so in Silicon Valley. And we focus mainly on financial software, financial tech software for everyone. So making sure that people have access to the ability to develop small businesses, to develop personal finance skills, to develop entrepreneurship skills. And so we really resonate with what Enactus is doing and with the World Cup and Climate Action Race. And our focus is also on supporting customers. And in my experience working overseas as well with nonprofits, there's a lot to resonate that we see when we see young people like you all supporting communities and supporting the people around you and supporting through the UN SDGs. And it's really a great opportunity for us to be here and to help however we can through our programs and our tools that makes Intuit the success that it is. So just thank you for being here, and have the opportunity to join and support these entrepreneurs and journey.
Awesome, thank you, Tamor, and a huge thank you to Intuit for making our Race for Climate Action possible. They're an amazing partner, and we're so lucky to get to work with them. And so with no further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, our presenter for today's session. Today we have with us Jonathan Foley, who is the Executive Director of Project Drawdown, and he will share more about Project Drawdown and all of their amazing work. But Project Drawdown is our Race for Climate Action education collaborator. So they work closely with us on some of the educational content that you'll see from the race, such as our education module that we have available, offering sessions like these. So we're very pleased to partner with them as well. So I am pleased to introduce Jonathan Foley. Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thanks to all the folks who are joining the call today. I really appreciate it. And it's so inspiring to see people from all over the world engaging in climate action projects and all these wonderful students everywhere. Also, a big thank you to Intuit for all the great support they give Enactus, but also to Project Drawdown and many other climate and sustainability themed work efforts around the world. It's really great to see that kind of leadership. So I'm going to give a presentation about climate solutions that I hope will be helpful. I'll probably go for about 40 minutes or so. And then at the end, I'll turn it back to Emily for some questions and conversation with all of you, I hope. And so why don't we just go ahead and get started, and I'll share the screen here. So today we're going to talk about a plan that can help address climate change. We all know that climate change is a problem. We all know that it's really, really serious and that we have to do something about it. And we often are engaged in conversations about the future, about how will we affect climate change moving forward? And that's really good and that's important. But to understand how we can make a better future, sometimes we have to stop and look at our past and wonder how we got here. Because the world has changed a lot in the last few decades in many ways, but in some ways it hasn't. Humans have always been affecting the environment. Since we first started our evolution, we first invented agriculture and fire and hunting and gathering and all these things in our past, we affected the environment around us all the time, but mostly at a very local level in just the immediate surroundings of our communities for the most part. But in the 20th century, and certainly in the 21st, we're now changing an entire planet. And that's because of many different factors, one of which is, well, there are more of us in the world today than there ever been. There are now close to 8 billion people in the world, and that's important. We are also, though, interestingly, now an urban species for the first time. Throughout all the rest of human history, most people lived out in rural areas around agriculture and out in the countryside. But today we are now living more in cities than any time in human history. Over half of the population, in fact, now lives in metropolitan areas. But the really big change is the rise of a truly global economy that just exploded in the last few decades. Fueled by technology, capitalism, consumer behavior, and international trade, we've seen a massive increase in the delivery and consumption of goods and services all around the planet. And if we look at the last 50 years, let's say, that last kind of part of the curve, we've seen some significant changes. Sure, we've about twice as many people on the planet today, but we have nearly 6 times more economic activity adjusted for inflation. So twice as many people, but doing about 6 times more stuff. That's quite extraordinary. That together means we're now about triple our demand for food than we were 50 years ago, a near doubling of water needs, and about a tripling of global fossil fuel combustion, which is one of the issues facing us with climate change. Before we move forward, I think it's really important to notice that just in the last 50 years, we have changed more than all previous human history combined. And that now means we're disrupting the planet, not just the local environment, but entire planetary systems. And that's really quite disturbing in some ways. Now, some of those things we're doing are very, very obvious. We can see them, we've seen them the whole time. For example, clearing rainforest, in this case, in part of the Amazon near Bolivia. This is a satellite image of a pretty remote part of the Amazon in the 1970s, and then taken again in the early 2000s. And we're seeing how large areas of forest are essentially being wiped out, in this case for soybean cultivation, where soybeans are being grown and then shipped to China from Bolivia in order to feed more pigs in China as more people eat meat as they get richer and move more to the cities. So agriculture in East Asia is influencing land use in the Amazon in a pretty significant way today. In fact, right now, we've already cleared about 30% of the world's tropical forest, which is a real problem for biodiversity, for watersheds, for local communities, and it turns out also for climate change. We humans have also manipulated water resources around the world. This is the former Aral Sea, one of the largest inland seas on the planet in the 1960s and 70s. But the Soviet Union, where the Aral Sea is or used to be, drained that lake, essentially, drained the Aral Sea by diverting the rivers that used to feed it with water. That water has been diverted into the Kazakhstan deserts to grow cotton for the most part. And this is what happened to the Aral Sea. It's essentially gone. We see now that the, whoops, what's going on here? Something's not working. There we go. And we see that the Aral Sea is now essentially gone. And water resources like this are collapsing all over the world, whether it's the Colorado River in the US, the Aguila Aquifer, Lake Chad in Africa, the Aral Sea. This is not because of climate change. This is because we're using more water than nature can replenish in many regions around the world, and that's causing water resources to collapse. So along with changes to land and water, we're seeing tremendous changes to the atmosphere and our climate system as well. Now, these are inherently difficult to see at first because the greenhouse gases that we are polluting the atmosphere with are inherently invisible. We can't actually see them. They're transparent to visible light, to solar radiation, and so we can't see that pollution we've put in the atmosphere. But we can certainly feel its effects once it builds up enough because it starts to change the weather and climate of our planet. Well, we started doing this a fairly long time ago. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide started increasing in the 19th century. CO2 levels alone of all the different greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere have risen about 50% since the mid-19th century. We also have seen that the temperatures of the planet have increased correspondingly, and so far have increased about 1.1 degrees Celsius so far. What's interesting is I start this curve back in the 1850s when these changes just started to be measurable. But also it's really important to know that's when the science of climate change really began. When I was a grad student, I learned that a British male scientist named Joseph Tyndall was the first person to write about the greenhouse effect and human activities back in the 1860s. But it turns out that's not true. It's actually an American woman named Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E, who first published that work 6 years earlier in 1854. But as a woman scientist in the 19th century, she wasn't even allowed to present her own paper. Her husband had to present it for her at the conference. And her work was largely overlooked for far too long. But now we know that she was really the first scientist in the world back when that curve began, who predicted that, yes, increasing greenhouse gases would warm the planet. And so we've known about this for almost 170 years, which is kind of extraordinary. But now we're living in a world that's changing just as scientists predicted way back then. Well, the issue of climate change has certainly stirred up a lot of emotion, a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion, and we haven't done very much about it, not as much as we should. And I think it's very reasonable for people today to be very upset about that. And some people get so upset about how climate change has gone forward without really much effect from policymakers and businesses yet, though beginning to change now, that it can look a little hopeless sometimes, that we see the environment changing and it seems like we're not doing enough. But let me assure you that it is not hopeless. We can actually still change the future. The future is always being written. Tomorrow depends a lot on the decisions we make today. Yes, it is too late to stop all climate change because we've already experienced a lot of it. But we can stop a lot of the climate change that could otherwise happen in the future. We have a choice to make, a choice between a world that could careen out of control and have catastrophic climate change, or one where we limit the climate change to something more reasonable. That's up to us still. We have that choice, we have the capacity to make that choice, and we better make it soon. And that's what we're about at Project Drawdown. We're trying to help the world make better choices around climate solutions. We use science and kind of analytical research to understand which solutions are the best ones, the most effective, the most cost effective, et cetera, and then help people deploy them in the world. But what do we use this name Drawdown for? What does that actually refer to? Well, Drawdown refers to this curve. Greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, but also methane and many, many others, have all been increasing in the atmosphere thanks to our activities. We caused that. And looking forward into the future, we have a choice to make. Will we just continue on the path we're on now, where more greenhouse gases trap more heat in the atmosphere, causing more warming, more disruptions to weather and climate patterns, more disruptions to water, to ecosystems, to food, our health, our cities, our lives? Or do we change that future? Do we bend the curve, essentially? Kind of like we're trying to do with our pandemic of COVID-19. We talk a lot about bending the curve back down to something healthier. We need to do the same thing for the atmosphere and basically stabilize greenhouse gases and bring them back down again someday. Well, the point here at that blue dot is what we call the moment of drawdown. It's when the levels of greenhouse gases stop rising and then they stabilize. And then maybe eventually they start to go down again, which would eventually slow climate change, stop it, and maybe even reverse it. So that blue dot is what we're working for, the moment we stop the future warming of our planet and begin the process of stabilizing our climate system. So how do we get there? How do we get to drawdown? Well, first we have to know a little bit of science. It's great to be an activist. It's great to be an entrepreneur. It's great to be a leader on climate issues. But if you don't know a little of the science, you're not doing much good. So please spend a little time learning the basics here so we know what we're talking about. Far too many politicians and activists talk about climate change, but they don't really know what they're talking about. So let's spend a few minutes just getting the basics down. It's pretty simple stuff. And that'll equip you to be a far better climate solutions expert moving forward. So it turns out, as we all know, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and many others are all increasing because of human activities. This is where they come from for the most part. CO2 largely, but not entirely, comes from burning fossil fuels. That's the largest part of what's causing climate change, but not the only part. It's about 60% of the problem. 40% of our climate change has nothing to do with fossil fuels, and we have to address that as well. In fact, CO2 is emitted from making cement and concrete, not because of fossil fuels involved, but because of the chemistry of cement. When cement is curing, it outgasses CO2, for example. We also have CO2 emitted in the atmosphere from burning down forest, from deforestation and other land use practices. This is kind of astonishing. Deforestation and land use contribute about 11% of climate change greenhouse gases today. The United States is about 12% of global emissions and falling. Deforestation and land use is 11% and rising again, about the same as the entire US economy. That's huge, and we never hear enough about this. We have to do a lot to stop deforestation. We have other greenhouse gases too, including methane. Methane comes from two big areas, agriculture and the energy industry. From agriculture, most of the methane comes from cattle and other livestock that burp methane as part of their digestive process. When they eat grass and other kinds of things, they're digesting that in an anaerobic environment and releasing methane as part of their digestive process. So that's huge. Rice fields are also a little source of methane too, from the agricultural sector. But methane is also what we know as fossil gas or natural gas, whatever you want to call it. And so in the energy industry, leaking wells, fracking, natural gas pipelines that have leaks in them, our own appliances, stoves, and so on, all leak little bits of methane into the atmosphere, but that adds up and is a significant part of what's causing climate change as well. Then we have a few other gases you don't hear about very much, like nitrous oxide, N2O. That mainly comes from agriculture, a little bit from industry, mostly when we overuse fertilizers and manure on our fields, because the nitrogen in the fertilizer, in the manure, can mix with air and water under certain circumstances and gas out this stuff into the atmosphere. So managing fertilizers turns out to be a pretty big part of climate change too. Then we have more exotic gases, the biggest of which are the fluorinated gases, F gases, including hydrofluorocarbons, old CFCs, and sulfur hexafluorine, and other gases that have fluorine in them. A lot of these are being used as refrigerants today in air conditioners, refrigerators, freezers, things like that. And those are considered kind of super pollutants. Right now, they're causing about 2% of current climate change, but the number would grow considerably as many more people in the world are now getting rich enough to buy their first air conditioners, refrigerators, and other consumer devices that use these gases. So if we're not careful about how we use these gases and how we capture them later, that 2% number could grow a lot and could be a significant problem in the future. So that's kind of where greenhouse gases come from, fossil fuels and energy-related sources in orange. Materials like refrigerants and concrete and cements in kind of the red color, and then land use and agriculture in the green. So we have to fix the energy system, our materials, and our agriculture and land use in order to truly address climate change in a serious way. So that's a bit of the chemistry of where that stuff comes from. Let's take those chemical formulas and rearrange them and put them in terms of economic activities, kind of the different sectors of the economy that are doing these things. And that's what this curve is showing. Each of these arrows represents the human activity that contributes all of those greenhouse gases. We'll go through them in a minute, but you can see right now words like electricity and industry, transportation, agriculture, and so on. These are the activities that we humans do that cause greenhouse gas emissions. These numbers are for the entire globe, so that kind of 100% of emissions on the left-hand side of that diagram show all the world's greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. But the atmosphere doesn't sit still. It has its own physics, its own chemistry, and it participates with the biology of the planet. And actually what we find is about half of the carbon dioxide and about 40% of all the greenhouse gas is removed by nature each and every year. These are what we call carbon sinks, things that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Right now, these sinks are entirely due to nature. While humans talk a lot about building our own carbon sinks with machines or with agriculture and planting trees, right now nature's doing all of that heavy lifting, and we can't even measure the human impact on this yet in the atmosphere. Almost all of that removal is happening in forest and in the oceans. And so when we think about climate change, we have to think about all of that too. So here's the basic math. We put in about 100 units of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Nature removes about 41 of those units, leaving behind 59 of them, or call it 60 in round numbers. About 60% of the greenhouse gases left behind. And that's what's building up year over year over year, causing more climate change. So this is the basic chemistry, physics, biology of the whole thing in one diagram. This is the most important picture when it comes to climate change you're ever going to see. So to achieve drawdown, to stop climate change, we have to look at both sides of this diagram. First, of course, we have to reduce the sources of pollution, the things that are causing the pollution in the first place. We need to bring them down to zero. And we have to do that as quickly and safely and equitably as possible. Some of that's going to be very difficult, especially in industry and a few other areas where we don't quite know how to get rid of all the emissions yet. But some of them are pretty straightforward, like electricity, deforestation, other things. We know how to do that, and we know how to do it a long time. So we're going to walk through a lot of solutions to reduce the pollution a little bit later. We also, though, have to support the natural sinks of carbon that exist in the world. Right now, whatever we emit, about 40% of that amount will be removed by nature. As we lower the emissions, the amount that's being removed stays a fixed fraction of that, about 40%. So we have to continue to support healthy forests and healthy oceans to help remove some of that remaining carbon. It's never going to remove all of it, leaving behind 60%, but it can help remove a little bit what's there. So to stop climate change, we have to stop pollution and protect and support nature. Those are the two big parts of the solution. So let's walk through them a little bit in more detail. To reduce greenhouse gas pollution, the sources of the pollution, let's bring those emissions to zero. Well, we have to do this sector by sector of the economy. Now, the numbers I'm showing you are for the entire world put together. The variations of like what comes from electricity or land use or industry locally depends very much on where you live. Some places have a lot more industrial emissions, other places have more in agriculture or in forest and so on. But this is the global total, which matters a lot too. So globally, making electricity, burning coal and natural gas to make electricity is causing about 1/4 of climate change. In the media, and I think some people assume that it's more like 90%, but it's actually about 1/4. Interestingly, food, agriculture, and land use is also 1/4 of our emissions, about equal to electricity. Most people have no idea that that's true, but it is. I'll show you why in a few minutes and where those come from. Then we have industry emissions, kind of making stuff and managing the world's waste. We have transportation, which is about 14%, moving stuff and people around the world. Buildings directly emit about 6% of global emissions, but buildings, of course, use a lot of the electricity we produce, a lot of the materials made in industry, and they also determine a lot of our transportation choices. So the built environment has a lot of emissions, much bigger than the buildings themselves have. And then other emissions, mainly from the energy industry itself or other kinds of activities, are the last 10%. But 90% of emissions come from 5 very basic things: making electricity, making food, making stuff in industry, transportation, and buildings. That's 90% on just one hand. Pretty simple. So let's walk through each of those and see if we can unfold some very specific choices about how to reduce emissions. In electricity, of course, making electricity using coal and fossil gas causes those emissions. Burning carbon produces carbon dioxide. So when we make electricity in different ways with solar, wind, nuclear, hydro, whatever, those emissions go down automatically. That's great. But we can also look at how we use electricity and ask, do we really need so much, especially in rich countries where we tend to waste a lot of energy? So this is where energy efficiency comes in. Can we reduce the demand for electricity in buildings or in industry or other sectors so we don't even need to make as much as we are today? That would be good too. So at Drawdown, we look at all these different possibilities and assess current technologies and practices, solutions that we have right now. There are other solutions coming later, of course, but these are the solutions we have today. So these are solutions here in all those little circles around energy efficiency. And these are the ones that could produce electricity without burning carbon. The bigger the circle in this diagram means the bigger the solution could be in affecting climate change. So we have a whole bunch of solutions in energy efficiency on the right and many solutions on the left with current technologies that could be used to produce electricity without greenhouse gases. So taking all these together, we have enormous opportunities to reduce emissions in the electricity sector. Food and agriculture and land use, another big emitter, 24%. The problem here is mainly from deforestation, burning down rainforest for more agricultural land. Most deforestation in the world today is for things like soybeans, for animal feed, for beef and cattle in the Amazon, for palm oil, for human consumption. timber, and other kind of goods and services as well. So deforestation is a big, big contributor to climate change and also is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss in the world. We definitely need to do more about this. The second biggest emitter in agriculture is methane, mostly from animals, a little bit from rice fields. So beef and dairy products especially are very, very climate intensive, and we need to fix that as well. Then we have nitrous oxide, using too much fertilizer, too much manure. Those are really important areas. Everything else in the food system is the last 5%. And so when we look at food solutions, we see efficiency on the left, reducing food waste, because 40% of all the food on the planet is never even eaten. That means 40% of the land and water and greenhouse gases and everything else weren't even necessary. Eating more plant-rich diets that don't emit big methane sources from cattle and so on, or clear a lot of land for beef and animal feed, that would help as well. That doesn't mean everybody has to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but it could, especially in rich countries, are eating probably too much meat for our health. If we dialed that down a lot, it would help enormously for climate change as well. Then on the right, we can grow food better by protecting the ecosystems around agriculture so we don't tear down forest or sensitive ecosystems, and farming better on the land we already have. So this combination of diet changes, food waste, protecting ecosystems, and farming better has a lot of solutions there. Industry is a little more complicated. We have solutions here, but we have to have them in many different kind of areas, including making metals, especially steel. That's a very carbon intensive process. Cement that I already mentioned before, how to make carbon neutral or carbon free or carbon negative cements. That's possible, but it's not very economical just yet. Chemical production here, including polymers, plastics. Plastics about 1% of what causes climate change today, maybe 1.5%, but that could grow and we need to solve that. Plus plastic is a really nasty pollution in other ways out there in the world. Let's fix it. Managing the world's waste streams, especially wastewater and municipal and solid waste, that's really important as well. But these are all very different sectors, and these might be some of the more difficult ones to decarbonize in the future. Transportation is very important, about 14% of emissions. Almost all of that is on roads. 10 of the 14% is trucks, vehicles, passenger cars, heavy duty vehicles, so on and so forth. So 10% of that 14 is on the roads. Flying, including all commercial and military aviation, is about 1.8%, still very important. Shipping and trains are very important, 1 or 2% here. So everything will add up and we need to address all of it. Buildings directly, in addition to the electricity, materials, and transportation they affect, buildings directly from furnaces, boilers, hot water heaters, cook stoves, leaking refrigerants, all those things, that emits about 6% of global emissions. 2 to 1 of that emissions comes from residential buildings, our homes, apartments, dorms, and so on, compared to commercial and public buildings. So those are all the areas where we can reduce emissions, and I hope a lot of you are thinking about projects and work that maybe could help address some of those. The other side of the equation, though, is to help support nature in removing carbon. We sometimes call carbon sinks just carbon removal, and I really want to stress that nature is doing all of this right now. There is a lot of hype out there right now about carbon capture machines, direct air capture, carbon capture, sequestration. They don't work, and they never have. They might in the future, but we've spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on these for decades with nothing to show for it right now. In fact, it's mainly been propping up the oil and gas industry to claim that they'll be carbon neutral. It doesn't work. Maybe it will in the future, but right now nature's doing at least 10 million times more than all human activities in terms of sequestering carbon. So if I were a betting man, I would bet on forest and on oceans to help address climate change. And then later, let's hope that engineers and scientists develop some machines and other practices that can sequester carbon, remove it from the atmosphere. But right now, the hype of that is way, way out of head of reality. And so just be careful there. It's also giving license to people who keep polluting today with a vague promise of removing that pollution in the future. Don't buy it. That isn't going to work. We need to stop pollution today and support nature today in order to get to climate change solutions. There's a third area of climate solutions that's very, very interesting to me, that is really not starting out to be a climate solution, but rather solutions that help address other societal problems. For example, helping to increase access to healthcare and education for women and girls around the world, or helping indigenous communities protect their own land and have land tenure. Those things initially are really about human rights and elevating the human condition worldwide, which is, of course, the most important thing we could be doing. But in addition, when we do that, it sets off a chain of events that can also contribute back some additional climate solutions, like protecting forest or changing patterns of leadership and consumption and growth around the world. All of those things are really important too, but we do them because they improve society, and later they might help us with climate change as well. Putting together the big picture, though, we can see lots of areas where work is needed to help address climate change. First, reducing the pollution in the first place, supporting the sinks of carbon in nature for the most part on land, and increasingly more and more things in the ocean that we can do, and then improving society in ways that can help actually address climate change as well. And if we do all of those things, there's no one solution, but if we put them all together, we have a whole suite of solutions that together can bend the curve and change the future. So right now we're heading on this kind of red curve, which would cause really serious and dangerous climate change. But we could do this. We could bend those curves downward into the yellow and green areas where we stop climate change in sometime in the 2040s, 2050s, or 2060s. Those are all possible still if we act now to begin to change the future more. If we did that, that would stop climate change from rising above about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Sadly, we're already at about 1.1 degrees, maybe 1.2 pretty soon. So we can't avoid all of that, but we can avoid it getting much worse beyond 2 degrees. Those are still possible. So what have we learned so far? Well, first of all, we've learned it's not too late to stop climate change in the future. It's too late to stop what's already happened, of course, but it's not too late for it to be curtailed from getting really bad in the future. And we have a choice to make. Will we do that or not? But I assure you, we do have enough solutions right now without any new technologies to stop climate change. And of course, new technologies will just make it better, faster, and cheaper all along. So we have good things coming, and we already have enough to get started. The other good thing is these solutions can make the world better, not just stopping climate change, but they could create jobs, improve health, maybe reduce some inequities around the world that fossil fuels and the big ag systems are producing. Maybe it'll make our cities better and more equitable with more justice. Maybe we'll just live better lives while we're also addressing climate change. But to do that, we have to get started now and really accelerate action. We have done some good things. The beginnings of climate action are starting now. There's actually more good news than there is bad news sometimes, even if the media and politicians and activists don't like to talk about that. There is some good news out there, and you're a part of that good news. But we have to accelerate what we're doing dramatically. This is basically the curve that matters most. What we have to do is, starting at that little red dot, is we have to drive down emissions of greenhouse gases really quickly, basically cutting them in half sometime in the next decade or so, then cut them in half again and half again after that. Even if we can pull all that off, we still have to have a very ambitious growth of carbon removal by planting trees, farming better, maybe deploying technologies that could grow in the 2040s or 2050s. And so if we did all that, but right now, we have to reduce emissions dramatically. And that's going to require some very rapid action now. So what I call quick wins, things that could reduce emissions today without spending trillions of dollars or decades worth of labor to do it. Things like stopping deforestation, things like stopping the leaks of methane from pipelines and abandoned wells, things like quick wins in energy efficiency or food waste, things that we could do today without having to rebuild the world's infrastructure or dramatically hurt people's economy, jobs, and so on. Things we could do now, mainly because we're doing kind of stupid things that could stop. In addition to that, starting now, we also have to rebuild a lot of the world's infrastructure around energy, transportation, industry, agriculture. All of those have to be updated and changed in very fundamental ways. That'll take decades to complete and trillions of dollars. So we better start now. And it turns out, though, doing this is really good for us because we can modernize our infrastructure, make it better, create jobs, improve resilience, reduce inequities, and build better communities. We also can work with nature, not only to protect it, but we can plant more trees, restore more soils, farm better, and maybe put carbon back into vegetation and soils. The problem is it takes 20, 30, 40 years for the atmosphere to notice the soils growing in carbon or the trees growing to maturity. Those take time. So we need to plant those trees now and farm our soils better now, but the atmosphere might not notice the impact until much later because those are slow cumulative accumulations of carbon. So we need to do that as well. And then finally, investing in technologies today, it may or may not work right away, but some of them will pay off in the long run. And by the 2030s and 2040s and 2050s, we're going to be very glad we invested in R&D today because we'll need some of those technologies later to kind of finish the job. So in climate solutions, I think it's really important to work in all four of these tracks simultaneously. The quick, immediate reductions in greenhouse gases we can do today, rebuilding infrastructure, investing in nature, investing in technology. And if we do all that, it's not just that we've addressed the climate problem. I think we're presented with an incredible opportunity to build a better world. Too much of the world is still reflecting the technologies and power structures and politics of the 19th century. Very inequitable systems, using polluting substances like fossil fuels, having agriculture and food systems that are polluting and harmful, not very healthy for us or healthy for nature. We get to reimagine all of it and reboot the world with better systems for energy, for cities, transportation, and food, all of it. And so I hope that you will be part of this. Can we all learn and share with each other? Because no one group or one person or one country could ever do all of this alone. But if we learn together and share what we've learned, share what we do, we can change the world. And so I'll hope that you will exercise your leadership. Don't wait for elected officials to solve the problem. They're the last people to help us with climate change. Think of the most important changes in our lifetime. How many of them were led by a politician? Hardly any of them. Politicians don't lead, they follow. What we need is real leadership in society, people in business, in technology, in activism, in culture, in science, in community-based leadership, in neighborhoods and towns, people in universities like yourselves. Let's be the leaders we can be. And the politicians and the media people, they'll follow us later once it gets easy. But we have to do the hard work and show how to do it, roll up our sleeves and do the real work. And finally, I want us all to remember that the future isn't written yet. We can change it. We can always change tomorrow with better choices today. And Robert Wilson likes to remind us the future is up for grabs. It belongs to any and all who will take the risk and accept the responsibility of consciously creating the future they want. So let's work together and build the future we want and do that starting today. So with that, I'll stop my little slide share and hope to flip it back to you all for some questions and answers and conversation. And hoping Emily can maybe help MC this so we can have a nice conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I know I learned a lot and I've actually seen you present before. I learn something new every time. So yes, we would love to open it up for questions. Feel free to drop a question in the chat box. You're also welcome to raise your hand. Feel free to ask about the presentation. If you have your own climate action project that you'd like to chat about or ask a question, the floor is open.
Also can mention while questions are coming in, if you'd like to see some other videos related to this or some of the slides I used, if you go to drawdown.org, and look for something called Climate Solutions 101. It's a little online class that actually Intuit and Train Technologies helped us produce. That's basically a little online mini class, but there's also some slides and visuals and readings that might be helpful if you'd like to learn more about some of these things.
All right, we have a quiet group today. All right, well, if we don't have any questions, I also welcome any Enactus staff members out there. If you have any questions, totally open. We can also go ahead and end if nobody has any discussion points, or Jonathan, if there's any questions you have for the group.
No, maybe we can give people back a little time if they like. I know folks are very busy, and probably everyone is a little tired of Zoom videos all the time. So totally happy to wrap up now, if that makes sense. But I just want to say thank you to all the Enactus team and Intuit team, but also all the students here involved with Enactus. It's really inspiring to see what you're doing to help really kind of lead the way on things like climate solutions and moving forward together. So very, very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jonathan, thank you so much. And the support of Project Drawdown and Intuit, it means so much to us to be able to offer these kinds of sessions like this today. So huge thanks to everyone. And students, if you have any questions at all, there's a lot of information on the Race for Climate Action Enactus Plus page. So that's plus.enactus.org. You can head over to the opportunities page to see the Race for Climate Action. And then also our email address is races@enactus.org. Don't hesitate to follow up if you have any questions at all about the race. We're happy to help. So thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.